Chapter 1. Ferran. A rare ice lily sprouted from the snow-covered earth, as pale blue and white as the frozen crags in which it grew. Delicately, with a blade sharp as a razor, the boy knelt and severed the stem of the cold flower. Its familiar petals brought him peace, if only for a moment, and if only because of what it had once meant to him. Cold wind blew around him, rustling the petals and tussling his dark, shoulder-length hair, but otherwise didn't bother him. Dark brown leather fortified his thin frame against the cold, and a thick-bladed dagger at his hip secured him against whatever winter beast may have gotten past the wall, though it did nothing to ease his fears. Winter was nearing its end, but spring had yet to reveal itself to the small village of Allhallow. A massive blanket of snow covered the landscape for miles, completely untouched except for one set of footprints that led to this particular crag. No man would venture this far out from the village proper in the dead of winter. No sane man, anyway. He was alone. The animal cry of a winter beast resonated in the distance, and the boy froze, the rhythm of his heart disturbed by a spike of panic. But he calmed himself. It was barely audible, and certainly on the other side of the snow wall. It had been years since anything had gotten under the wall, and even with the run of long winters they'd been having, there wasn't enough packed snow for beasts to reach the top. He hurried all the same. Through patches of brambles and over dead trees buried in white sheets, the boy pushed steadily the last mile or so toward home, or rather, the remains of what had once been his home. The sun was still high when the youth mounted a small rise, and the charred remnants of his life came into view. The decrepit house stood almost entirely decayed, barely 2 stones on top of one another, except for one small section of wall, which was supported by a mostly toppled chimney. Even in its ruined state, the sight of the secluded home flooded his mind with memories. Visions of a family assaulted him, visions of warmth and laughter and of life before the fire. Before him. Now all that remained were piles of char, ash, and the ever-present guilt of knowing that he had done this. 5 years, he thought. 5 years, and this is all that remains. Dead weeds choked the garden and climbed the remaining walls, yellow vines swallowing everything else. Even the old oak was dead and scorched, half its trunk blackened from a fire he had created. Those old flames consumed him still. Over the crumbled wall, he made out the spot where a blackening corpse had once lay, and with it, a familiar scream filled his consciousness, haunting and unforgiving. He resisted the scream for a time, but reached for his finger when it became too loud. A thick silver ring adorned the index finger of his left hand, worn nearly always. The form of a leaping wolf twisted about the band, fur whipped by a fierce and unseen wind. He ripped it from his finger reflexively, and the scream abated, but only for a moment. Being this close to his old home forced the unwanted memories upon him just as well as the ring, if not better. The youth stepped inside the ruin, and the scream grew louder. He closed his eyes. The memory of fire washed over him, bringing with it the same pain he felt in his shoulder and lungs that night 5 years before. The vision of his mind's eye began to darken from the right, and he let it. Best not to remember what smiled at him from underneath that forced forgetfulness. Not even today. A young girl's scream redoubled in his mind, drowning out all other thoughts as the flames rose ever higher in his head. The heat was terrible, intensifying until the wood blistered and ignited around him, yet the corpse under the blanket of shadow remained cold and black. He would not look. He could not. The screaming intensified, growing louder and louder with every repetition, rising in tandem with the flames on the walls until mercifully he allowed himself to open his eyes, and reality surrounded him again. Sweat beaded his palms and brow, skin feeling sensitive the way it had the night of the fire. Though he had not intended to, he had, at some point, fallen to his knees directly beside where a body had once lain. The lowering sun had moved in the sky. With deep breaths, he calmed his panicking nerves. It was only a memory. Looking down, he found with distaste that his grip had snapped the long neck of the rare flower he carried. Already it had begun to wilt. Feeling emotionally fatigued, the boy rose to his feet and rubbed his green eyes. They were rimmed with purple-black bags and appeared nearly as hollow as he felt, but no tears marked his cheeks. Those did not come so easily anymore. Outside the only unfallen wall, half submerged in dirt and snow, lay Hadria's old flower box, the one she hung by the front door. This was the real reason he was here. Digging with gloved fingers, he created a hole deep enough to hold the flower erect. It sagged slightly from the snap in its stem, but he didn't care enough to do anything about it. It would die eventually anyway, like the girl who had once adored it. Eager to leave the sight of his family's death behind, he made the short walk back to Ulrich's tavern. Despite the effort required to get himself here, this was the last place he wanted to be. Dead branches reached up from the snow and grabbed at his leathers as he trudged his way north to the village, aware all the while of the sun's gradual descent toward the horizon. A few minutes later, he braced himself outside the tavern door, savoring the last few moments of freedom. It was time to work. Jobs were never easy, but this one was going to be bad. Very bad. He swallowed hard and slipped in, hood pulled tight against his face. The chances of being recognized on a night like this were low, but still. It was better to be careful. The tavern wasn't busy. People in this one-gate town avoided going out in winter if they could, even to cross the street. There was a great wooden palisade to keep out snow beasts, but the villagers had little faith in it. Avoiding the few patrons in the stuffy room, he ascended the stairs and entered the dark loft, where all the smoke and none of the light gathered. While uncomfortable, this place was ideal for someone who wished to remain unnoticed. Cynic sat at a corner table, leaning over his arms and snoring a ragged pattern. The youth approached the table, but didn't sit. He nudged the yellow-brown-haired boy's legs with a boot. Cynic stirred, bleary-eyed, and smacked his lips. "Morning already, Ferran." His eyes focused. "Right. How did it go, then?" "Fine, I suppose." He hesitated. "Thanks." "No worries. I managed to get myself a half-decent nap on a soft-spotted table here." He patted the rough wood affectionately. "Whereabout is the sun?" "We have maybe an hour." "All right, then. I suppose I'll just settle back down for a bit." Ferran kicked him. "It isn't near. We should go now." "Right then," Cynic agreed, rubbing his calf. "We go now. Lead the way." Donning their dark hoods, the two left the small tavern and entered the chill outside. Despite his thick leather blacks, the cold shocked Cynic in his drowsy state, and he cursed the ice in the name of the dead gods. The wind was beginning to pick up now as the sun set, and with it blew drifts of snow. Soon it would be a fierce gale, but they marched straight through it. While uncomfortable, it wasn't any threat to them, sheltered by softened leather. If anything, the wind would cover any noise they might make, or even obscure their tracks. The moon shone brightly overhead, the sky crisp and clear. The disk was nearly full. In the distance, but still uncomfortably close, Ferran heard the long howl of a wolf, large by the sound of it. It made every hair on his body stand on end, and for a moment he paused. "Ah, come on," Cynic said. "That's what walls are for. Let's get this done." They approached the south gate first, carefully sticking to worn paths as to not leave any obvious trails in the snow. Even in winter, there were too many footprints on the town paths to track with any reliability. The village was shut up tight, and the roads were empty. Doors and windows were bolted, with the occasional stream of light peeking from thick shutters under doors. Plaster and log homes, all roofed in thatch and snow, lined the dirt roadways. Some were new, but Ferran recognized most of them. He pulled the hood slightly farther over his face and trudged on. He hated taking contracts in his hometown, but it was the only way de Guerin would allow him this far from his clutches. At least Cynic had come along. When they reached the south gate, closed of course, they turned almost completely around and headed northeast, veering off the path and leaving deep footprints in the snow, a false lead for anyone brave enough to follow. All was quiet when they came into view of a large farmhouse with several surrounding buildings. One structure, from which emanated a powerful stench, was their target, Galvin's farm. The man had been a friend of his father before he died, and Ferran knew him relatively well, making this all the harder. Apparently, the man's farm had been doing well, because someone wanted it gone. Silent as shadows, Ferran and Cynic slipped inside and surveyed the beasts in the shelter. Nearly 100 pigs stretched out across the large barn, all sleeping contentedly. The smell of slop and filth was overwhelming, but they ignored the odor and began their work. Tightly bound bales of hay were stacked in a loft beyond the hogs' reach, which they used with pitchforks to barricade and bar the doors. Cynic pulled a bottle and flint from his pouch and handed the flint to Ferran. Unstoppering the alcohol made a small squeak, and a few hogs shifted but remained silent. With a flourish, Cynic poured the liquid under the loft, where it would easily spread, and made a trail to the far wall as a form of fuse. With large up and down motions, Cynic emptied the bottle on the floor, then gestured to Ferran to light it. Ferran stooped on one knee and made ready to strike, but stopped. Memories of his old home stilled his hand, and he began to shake. He struggled with the flint and steel, but trembled so sharply that he couldn't strike them. Screams. Fumbling with the flint, he pulled off the silver ring, but the terrified cry didn't go away. Arson had a way of doing that to him. With fumbling fingers, Ferran tried to strike the flint, but missed. He saw a dark shadow move on his right and flinched, but there was nothing there. Atha's grave, Cynic swore, snatching the firepiece away from him. With one fluid stroke, he sent a spray of sparks on the liquid, sending flames into the air. All in a moment, the trail of alcohol ignited, and every beast in the barn awoke in a squealing terror, stampeding all directions. Pure panic consumed the hogs' minds as the yellow flame spread, and their animal cries rose cacophonously into the night. Cynic pulled Ferran to his feet, narrowly avoiding getting trampled, and led him to the far wall. Screams. Such loud screams. And his shoulder burned. Cynic slapped Ferran hard, and he came to, holding a hand to his stinging cheek. They scaled old patchwork boards up to a window and slipped through, just in time to drop down and retreat to the shadows. Dark forms of men came running and yelling from 3 separate houses and bunkhouses, several only half-dressed. Heedless of the cold and snow beasts for a time, the men desperately tried to throw snow and water on the burning building, but the flames were coming from inside. It would do no good. A few men pushed on the doors, but they wouldn't budge. Ferran watched as the situation grew more and more desperate, and the screams of dying, tortured animals filled the night air. His gut twisted with a self-loathing he was unfortunately familiar with. Cynic touched his shoulder softly. "Come on. We're not done yet."